Okay, I'm back. Let's pick up where we left off, thinking about the spectrum of views concerning the status of morality. And we had some examples at the end of the first part. Examples of should claims. You should eat your Wheaties. You should bury your dead. You should keep your moral promises. Women should enjoy the same basic rights as men. These are moral judgments, ethical judgments. They contain a should. They express an ideal, a norm, a rule that you ought to live by. Let's look at the first one. You should eat your Wheaties. You know, parents say this to their children. Notice that this has a purely subjective basis. If you don't like Wheaties, if you don't desire Wheaties, there's no clear sense in which you should eat them. The should depends on personal preference. It's a matter of taste. So if I don't enjoy the taste of Wheaties, it's not true that I should eat them. The mother saying this to their child might be saying something more like, you should eat a healthy breakfast. I think that's typically what is meant here. And there we have more of a kind of ethical judgment. This is a good way to live, and you should strive to live this way, eating a healthy breakfast. That has a more objective feel to it. It sounds like a claim that could be true, even if you don't, at a particular moment in time, feel like eating a healthy breakfast. Maybe nevertheless it's still true that you should. Okay, but look at the second one. So the first one, since it makes reference to Wheaties, is a purely subjective claim. Right? There is no objective basis to that claim. And you might be a nihilist here, right? There's no such thing as should and shouldn't when it comes to eating, right? That's a fiction. It's just an expression of emotion, like, ooh, Wheaties, yummy. But it's not a claim that has objective basis. The second one looks like a culturally relative claim. You should bury the dead. Well, going back to thinking about the slide about relativism, right? Within many societies, right, the guiding ideal is that when a person dies, they should be buried, and there are certain rites and rituals that relate to the burial of the deceased. But in other cultures, right, the body is burned, not buried. So, right, given that you live within a particular social norm, or you're a society in which there are specific guiding ideals about how to treat the dead, right? Within that cultural context, it's true that I should bury the dead, right? My dead brother, my dead spouse, because that's how we do things around here, right? And that's how you respect the dead, by burying them. But in other cultures, you show respect for the dead by burning the body. Okay, so there's no objective truth here about how one ought to do it. It's a culturally relative claim. It depends, right? There's a truth here. There are truths about how you should bury the dead, but those truths are relative to a culture. Whereas in the first case, maybe there are, in some sense, truths about what's good to eat, but those truths are relative to the person, to the subject, to the individual. Look at the second two, though. The second two come closer to what the objectivist wants to claim are morally authoritative claims. The idea that you should keep your promises. This is something you should do, right? There's a norm, an ideal for how to live, and we should all strive to live up to this ideal, or to follow this norm. Is that an example of an objective claim, or is it merely relative to a culture, or just relative to a subject? Right? You could try to argue that this is based on cultural ideals, guiding ideals, and that those vary across cultures, and so that the should has to be relativized to that culture. So while it's true that you should keep your promises, it's only true relative to a particular culture. But the objectivist wants to argue that there's something more that we can say here, right? That keeping your promises is the right thing to do, full stop, right? Independent of the cultural norms and the cultural practices, right? And the guiding ideals of the society in which you live, right? So is that an example of a more objective claim? And then look at the last. Women should enjoy the same basic rights as men. Well, certainly there are many cultures that reject that. There are many cultures in which the guiding ideal is to treat women differently than men and to not afford all of the same basic rights to women. Do we have any grounds for criticizing those practices or those cultures, right? Is there any objective basis for defending the rights of women across cultures? Right? That's what's at stake here. All right, so Hume, we looked at a reading by Hume. He's a Scottish philosopher. These are his dates. Lived in the Enlightenment period, right? The period of Enlightenment in England, Scotland, 1700s. And he was also an historian, an ethicist, and an essayist. Here are his major books. And we looked at something, I think, from the Enquiries Concerning Human Understanding. But he wrote about human nature. He wrote about morals. Okay. So this is a passage taken from Schaefer-Landau's The Ethical Life, right? His anthology. He's excerpting a passage from, I believe, Hume's treatise. This is on page 176. And you can, let's go to that text. Sorry, this is from his treatise of human nature, so published in 17, well, here it says 39. So this is from Hume's treatise, and he's making the argument that there are no objective moral truths. That first of all, when we think about the act of murder, there's nothing just in our thought process that leads to the conclusion that it's wrong. There's nothing in the nature of the idea of murder, right, that leads to the conclusion that it's wrong, right? A contrast there would be when I think of the idea of a square, I'm led to the conclusion that it has 4 sides, right? All I have to do is think about it, and I know that squares have 4 sides, right? That's one kind of truth, a truth that we know by just reflecting on the relationship between our ideas. Another way we can arrive at the truth is by discovering matters of fact, right? So since we can't know that murder is wrong just by thinking about the idea of it, Hume thinks the only way we could show that there's some truth of the matter is by discovering or identifying the relevant matter of fact that shows that murder is wrong, or the wrongness of murder, or the viciousness of murder. But so he asks you to conduct a thought experiment. Take any action allowed to be vicious, let's say murder, something that we consider wrong. Look at the act itself and see if you can find any matter of fact or real existence which you call vice. Where is the vice or the wrongness in the act? Like, can you observe it? Can you pick out that property that makes it wrong? And he thinks that in whichever way you take it, no matter how you look at the act of murder, all you find when you try to discover what makes it wrong are certain things in you, passions, motives, volitions, and thoughts inside you, right? So the passion would be, anger. I'm angry when I read stories about people killing each other on the streets. Or a motive, like I see within myself a strong motivation not to commit murder. I have no desires. My desires run against it, right? All of my beliefs, right? Everything I think about murder associates it with something I shouldn't do. But so that's discovering something about me, my attitudes. There is no other matter of fact in the case. The vice entirely escapes you until you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation. All you find when you look for the wrongness of murder is something in you, in yourself, something subjective. So there are no objective moral truths, right? Nothing all by itself makes murder wrong, independently of our subjective attitudes toward it. We have negative attitudes toward it. That's why. Right? That's what explains the wrongness of it, right? That we have a negative attitude toward it, right? So that's Hume. And that's a form of ethical relativism, right? That the rightness and wrongness of an action can only be explained relative to the attitudes of the culture, right? or the attitudes of an individual. I think Hume is more of a cultural relativist, right? The rightness or wrongness of an act, right, is relative to the cultural practices, the cultural norms, the cultural attitudes. Well, what's appealing about this view? This is something that Schaefer-Landau spends some time addressing. Well, it gets at the idea that we think of morality as a human construction. Morality applies to human beings, right? If there were no human beings in the world, there would be no such thing as morality. That seems like an appealing truth. And so ethical relativism seems to kind of explain that aspect of morality, that it comes from us and it only applies to us. It also gives a more scientifically respectable explanation of what morality is, right? Morality is a description of human attitudes toward their behaviors, right? So we can give a kind of psychological explanation of where morality comes from and what it's describing. It's describing, right, the attitudes of people within a culture, right? And we can describe, we can we can study that. We can empirically describe and examine people's psychological and sociological attitudes toward different types of behavior. There's a simple explanation that the ethical relativist gives for what is required for moral knowledge. If I want to know what's right and wrong, I just have to look at what the customs are in my culture. What are people's attitudes? That's all there is to know when we're trying to understand morality. We're just trying to understand people's attitudes. Some would argue relativism is an egalitarian approach to morality, because it implies that everyone is an excellent judge of morality, right? Everyone can reflect on their attitudes and the attitudes of their culture, and that's all you need to know in order to know the difference between right and wrong. What are the customs of my society, right? And it also acknowledges and accepts cultural difference. And this is, for many, the main appeal of relativism, right? We have a responsibility to acknowledge and accept differences. But notice this is the beginning of a potential problem with cultural relativism. Because if we think that cultural difference is something that we ought to accept, that's itself a moral claim. Why do we think that? Why do we think it's morally better to accept cultural difference and acknowledge cultural difference than to ignore it? Can the relativist explain why it's good, right, to be tolerant of other cultures? Why it's good to embrace diversity? It's not clear in the end that the ethical relativist can explain that, because the ethical relativist is committed to the view that moral judgments are relative to a culture. Okay? But here the suggestion is that respecting cultural difference is a universal moral value. It's that it's good to respect cultural difference is a universal moral truth. But according to the ethical relativists, there are no universal moral truths. Okay, so that's leading to the potential problems. Okay, and this is where we'll pick up in the next video. But look at the bottom problem. Ethical relativism seems to lead to the problem of contradiction. And again, these are all issues that Schaefer-Landau addresses in chapter 19. It seems like an incoherent position. If the claim is that all moral judgments are relative to a culture, then there's no basis. There's no basis for claiming that every culture should respect cultural difference, or every culture should be tolerant of other cultures. And so the view, which is designed to give us a reason to respect cultural difference, in the end leads to a kind of contradiction or incoherence, because it doesn't have a way of explaining why we should respect cultural difference, why we should be tolerant of other cultures. Okay, so we'll look at the other problems in the next video and look at the remaining slides together. Okay, that's it for now.